Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alex Poole, and I'm an associate professor at Drexel University's College of Computing, as well as a two-time SILS alum. It's a privilege for me to be here and to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Sumayya Ahmed. She was recently appointed the executive director of the Black Metropolis Research Consortium at the University of Chicago. Prior to this appointment, she taught as an assistant professor at Simmons University in the School of Library and Information Science. Her research centers on documentary heritage, societal provenance, archival history, and the politics of cultural preservation in North Africa, the region called the Middle East, and African America. Dr. Ahmed earned her PhD in information science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2016. There she held the Elam 21 grant and was the co-editor of the 2016 De Gruyter volume, Library and Information Science in the Middle East and Africa. Currently, she is the co-editor for the Routledge Studies and Archives series. With that, I'd like to welcome her. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. I'd like to thank SILS for inviting me here today, and to all the people who worked to get me here, Susan for the behind-the-scenes work and her patience with me, and Alex and Cal as well. And thank you to everyone who's here in the audience. I do have some slides which I will share, and so bear with me 1 second while we do that. So I think we're on the same page now. Okay. So it has been hard for me to prepare for this, to speak today because of what is still happening in Gaza. And I'd hoped for a permanent ceasefire by the time I would give this talk, and we're not there yet, but I will still go on. I've dedicated this talk to the memory of the late Barbara Moran, to honor all that she did for me personally, and I assume that she did for others as well. I remember the first time I met Barbara in her office in SILS in 2011. I think I remember her giving me a hug. Barbara Moran was a very special mentor for me personally and was a great mentor for me into the field of library and information science. One of the things that she did that I still appreciate is that she always validated my presence. In my early days in the doctoral program at UNC, where maybe I seemed like a fish out of water coming from a different locale and a different field, she would always mention my previous educational qualifications. I didn't understand it then, but I realized she was trying to say, you know, you belong here. You have what it takes to succeed here. And she also shared with me stories from her childhood in Alabama. I have grandparents from Alabama, so I really enjoyed hearing her experiences about growing up in Alabama because it reminded me of my family. And she was very candid about her own experience of trying to come to terms with race and racism as a young white woman aware of her privileges. The last time I saw her in this world was in 2016. We were having lunch together on Franklin Street, and we were talking about the way things were starting to look politically in the country. And Barbara said to me, quote, "It's like the summer of 1969. You wake up and wonder, well, what will happen today?" I was very grateful to have her as a mentor, and I miss the opportunities to connect and contact her now when I want to have someone to reflect with. Barbara was not only my mentor here in Chapel Hill, but we traveled together to Morocco. And these photos you see here are actually photos that I took of our trip to Morocco, visiting a library school there in Rabat. And it was a great pleasure to be in her presence and to learn from her. I'll talk some about my own positionality, which is something that, at least in the field of archives, we tend to do, we tend to share. So we tend to share our positionality to say where we come from so that you understand the subjectivity of what I'm presenting to you today. I'm African American. I learned that term when I was in grammar school. Before that, we were just Black. I was born in Chicago. My grandparents and great-grandparents were part of what was called the Great Migration, one of the largest internal movements of people within the United States that happened sometime between 1917 and the 1940s for some historians, and up into the 1970s for other historians. It was then that there was a large exodus of millions of African Americans leaving the American South and going north or west, seeking refuge from sharecropping and poverty and racism and lynching. So my great-grandparents moved from Alabama to Chicago in the 1930s, and another set of grandparents came from Mississippi. The experiences that they shared with me was a formative part of my experience growing up in Chicago. And of course, Chicago is an experience of its own. It's also part of my experience that I converted to the religion of Islam as a teenager and set about studying Arabic, living in and visiting a lot of places in the Muslim and Arab world. So it is from this place that I speak and that I move through the field of LIS. I'm grateful to a SILS faculty member who shall go unnamed, who at one point during my first few weeks at UNC said that they didn't want to see me at UNC in 4 years, after 4 years, unless I was on faculty. They didn't say unless you're giving an alumni talk, so I guess it's okay for me to be here today. So the title of my talk is, they are the text, while you're a footnote or in a margin. This is a line taken from a poem by Tamim al-Barghouti, a Palestinian poet. The poem is called In Jerusalem. And if I'm correct, I think the voice saying that is history with a capital H. History is speaking to the poet, but we'll come back to that later. For now, I'll start with a story that started about 2 years ago while I was walking around my local small town, suburban Massachusetts library. I saw a book that stuck out to me on the shelf called The Negro Caravan. It was on the shelf looking old and worn and calling out to me. I took it down and just looked at the table of contents and was blown away. It was at this point that I remembered something I had learned from a talk given by Elizabeth Ott, who is now the interim associate university librarian for special collections and the director of Wilson Library at UNC. Well, I heard Elizabeth give a talk at the Sharp conference in probably 2018 or 19, and she was talking about how when she started at UNC, she was in shock to find that some editions, first edition books of Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston were still in circulation at the UNC library. Students could still check them out. Because of that, they were in this kind of deteriorated condition. And she juxtaposed that with the fact that the very same editions, first editions of Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston at Howard University had decades earlier been taken out of circulation and put into the rare books and special collections of the library, so that their actual physical condition was in much better shape. So I see this book on the shelf at my public library, and I think, oh, this book does not belong in circulation. I go down to check it out. I know this is ironic. I'm trying to check out a book that I don't think should be checked out, but I do want to spend some time with it. But as I'm checking it out, I say to the woman at the circulation desk, I say, look at this book. Don't you think maybe it shouldn't be in circulation? Now, mind you, I don't know the qualifications of the woman at the circulation desk, right? She could be a paraprofessional or have an MLS, I'm not sure. But she looked at the book with such disdain. Then she didn't say anything. She didn't say one word. She just went out about checking it out and kind of ignored me. So I decided to advocate for this book using the privilege that I had at that time working as an assistant professor at a respected library school. I looked up to the director of the library. She was actually a graduate of the library school where I was teaching. I said, okay, I'll write to the director. I'll use my library school email address and explain to this director that this book probably should be taken out of circulation. This is after looking it up and realizing it was the 1941 first edition and that it just needed a better home than a public library. So what I'm going to share with you is the literal transcript of what happened. Instead of giving you my interpretation of that interaction, I'm just going to read to you my actual email correspondence between me and the director of this suburban Massachusetts public library. Monday, November 21st, 2022. Sumayya Ahmed wrote, Dear Director so-and-so, I hope this message finds you well. I'm a resident of X town and I frequent your library. Recently, I checked out a book which I believe is special and perhaps should be taken out of circulation. It is the 1941 first edition of the anthology, The Negro Caravan. It contains the contributions of many notable poets and authors associated with the Harlem Renaissance. This book is currently checked out to me, but I would hope that it might be considered rare enough to be taken out of circulation. I understand that your library does not have a special collections, but I hope that some attention can be given to this in the near future. Thanks so much, Sumayya. Tuesday, November 22nd, 2022, Director so-and-so writes, Dear Sumayya, thank you for bringing this to my attention. Unfortunately, we don't have a special collections, and we're trying to reduce the amount of items in the reference non-circulating collection. I will definitely consider where it should be located after reviewing the item upon its return to the library. If we keep it in circulation, perhaps we'll limit it to only being picked up at the library so that it doesn't travel to other libraries. Sometimes in delivery, books can get a bit damaged. Thank you, Director so-and-so. Tuesday, December 6, 2022. Dear Director, thank you for your prompt response. Might I ask if it would be possible for me to purchase the book from the library? That might be the best chance for the book as an important part of African American cultural heritage to be preserved in some way. Please let me know what you think about this possibility. Many thanks, Sumayya. Thursday, December 8th, 2022. Dear Sumayya, I can completely relate to your sentiment of preserving the importance of this book. However, as a public library, we make available our collections to the public and can't sell them to patrons. The only stipulation on this is when a book is lost or damaged. We charge the patron a loss damage fee in order to replace it with the same title or something similar. What I can do is keep you in mind next time we're weeding the collection if this book is then set to be discarded. I'd rather it be in good hands. I was curious to see what other libraries might also have this book, and it does appear that we might be the only public library in the area with the 1941 edition. However, a bunch of Boston colleges and universities also have this in their collections. WorldCat also says that there is an ebook available, but I can't access it without the appropriate credentials. That would be wonderful, though, if it has in fact been digitized. Please let me know if you have any other questions. Thank you, Director. Friday, December 9th, 2022. Dear Director, thank you for your thorough response. My concern for the book is not because I want to have it in my personal possession, but because I understand the value of the book to African American literary history. And from doing some minor research, I also understand that the 1941 edition of the book is considered rare and is worth far more than the $20 someone would have to pay if they lost it or failed to return it. The Boyden Library may not be the most appropriate place for the book at this time if it cannot be set to in-library use only. My first preference is for the book to be a reference item or perhaps to be given to another library, for example, the Boston Public Library, which does have a special collections. My offer to purchase was intended to protect the book from any further damage until it could be rehoused in a more appropriate repository. I do hope that you will reconsider at least making it a reference item, as many libraries that hold the 1941 edition have done. Kind regards, Sumayya. That's the end of the correspondence. I didn't get a response back from the director. I do go to visit the book occasionally. I'm trying to keep it from being put on a weeding list. How do we interpret that interaction? How do we understand what I'm trying to say to her and what I interpret as her inability to consider my viewpoint or the value of the text? I felt completely impotent and went to many of my colleagues in the library field, my public library colleagues, my special collections people, the preservation people that I knew, and I all asked them what they thought about the situation. I even brought this up in my classes when I was teaching students of archives about how their appraisal decisions could affect someone, not just materially, but also emotionally. So in archival appraisal, students get to make decisions about, so in archival appraisal, archivists get to make decisions about what the future sees. Archivists make decisions about whether or not something is appropriately archival, what kind of value it has. We assign these different kinds of values. We say that this has informational value or research value, historical value, aesthetic value. even artifactual value. All of these reasons we can come up with for keeping something, and then we determine that other things aren't as important and don't necessarily need to be kept. When I tell the story to my students, they must always say, why don't you just check out the book and say you've lost it? Not only do my students tell me this, but I've actually spoken to library professionals who advise me the same. Check out the book, don't return it, pay the $20. But I can't do that. I'm in a bind. I tell the story because for me, it reflects the inability and unwillingness of a field to take into consideration the values of different communities. And I have a hard time coming to terms with and sharing a field with all of the equity and inclusive rhetoric of the field of libraries and archives when I actually see and experience encounters such as these. And I tie this experience to something that happened later when I got a gentle pushback from a former MLIS student when I was teaching. This student questioned the divider archivists try to make between monetary appraisal and archival appraisal. Right? At first I said, archivists don't do monetary appraisal. But then as I've come to start to really think about it and make connections to other things, I started to see the point the student was trying to make. The student was trying to say that in assigning archival value, we are somehow also assigning in an indirect way monetary value, that appraisal decisions are not disconnected from systems of accumulation of monetary and cultural wealth and power. So I started to see these connections. And then recently I was thinking about, and I was reminded of something the great Haitian anthropologist Michel Trujillo said, and I'll read from the slide. So Trujillo says, inequalities experienced by the actors lead to uneven historical power and the inscription of traces. Basically, what that means is that whatever place a historical actor, a person, or a community has in society, that place is generally going to be the same place that person has in the society's archives. And then that same place that person or community is going to have in that society's official formal history, right? So people who are valued less, not that they have less value, but they're valued less, they're seen by others in their day-to-day lives. Their materials are valued less for and in archives. And so their stories tend to also have less value in official histories. This isn't anything new. I'm sure this is things we've all heard over and over again, but making these connections between ongoing experiences is important. I think we sometimes talk about things as if it's been resolved, as if as a field we've resolved some of our ongoing biases. But I don't think that we're anywhere near resolving anything, because my experience in the field of library and information science is that people are not willing to have honest discussions that it would take to resolve things. So I'd like to also stay a little bit more with this book, Silencing the Past, and the author, and another section in the book starts to talk about value and silence. And there's a lot of, excuse me, my apologies. It's Ramadan, so I'm fasting. I can't do much about, I can't drink anything right now to kind of help this, but you'll bear with me. So the author is talking about silences. Now, there's a lot of talk in our field about archival silences. And the author talks a lot about silence as entering the process of historical production at very crucial moments. And I think this is something that we can learn from. So he talks about silence entering the production of history, first at the actual making of the sources. And I think, but he talks about silencing as an active process, right? An active process that is being done by the people who make the sources. So that's whoever's documenting it, right? And so this is, I think he uses a great analogy that's easy for us to understand, is that it's kind of like he uses the analogy of a sportscaster. Like if anyone ever watches professional sports, where the sportscaster is telling you about some of the action on the field, but the sportscaster is not telling you everything that's happening on the field, and is not telling you, it's not commenting, generally it's not commenting on things happening in the stands. There's just a certain thing that the sportscaster is focusing on that they think is the most important thing to report to the audience, and that's what we're getting. And so He's making that kind of a connection between the making of sources. What people choose to document is not everything that they saw or that happened, but what they think is the most important thing, right? And then we move on to the assembly of archives. So when archives are produced, when we decide to arrange collections, we're also making decisions, right? Those appraisal decisions, those acquisition decisions, right? This is another time he says when silence is entered, we decide, okay, that's not that important for prosperity to know about. And then there's the moment of retrieving, right? When we decide to make narratives, when a historian or a researcher or someone even just maybe researching their own family history, when they go to retrieve these narratives, they once again make decisions about what's the important parts, like what needs to be heard. And then the moment of retrospective significance, right? When we have this making of history, the history with an H, when we decide to tell the story of what actually happened or what happened. So these are all moments when he says, we have this accumulation of silences, presences, and absences. And I think that we should always talk about this in terms of what archivists are doing and not archives. In my talks, I tried not to use the term archive so much, but archivist. And I like to talk about archivists because there's action, there's some doing. And just the way as our author talks about silencing is an action. It's something that is done. So I think we fail ourselves in the field when we talk about archives and not about archivists who are doing the labor and making decisions. So it's archivists who arrange collections, who organize and describe them, and they, for the most part, are responsible for presences and absences. And I think it's good to think about silencing as an active process and that individuals or communities are actively silenced. Why does this matter so much? I guess one of the reasons why, and this is things that for the archivists, and this is things that we've already learned, archiving as an active process leads to all of the things you see on this slide, right? This historical intelligibility, debatability, credibility, and authority. For whom? For the community that can use those records, for the people who can use those records, right? To validate their experiences, right? And so we might also assume that this leads to other kind of material benefits within society. But I think we should also acknowledge that the power that archives wields also extends to library schools and LIS education. I'm mentioning this because in my own experience of the last few years of teaching in LIS and feeling as if I felt as if all the rhetoric of my field could not change the reality of the inequalities I kept seeing magnified within my own classrooms. I've recently taken on this new position, as was mentioned earlier, as the executive director of the Black Metropolis Research Consortium at the University of Chicago. It is an organization that seeks to facilitate the documentation, location, and accessibility of archival material about Black life in Chicago throughout the history of the city. This means working with archives, museums, special collections at universities to locate what is in their collections that relates to Black history, Black experiences, and culture. It is a great task, and there are amazing materials that have been brought to life, and there are also many materials sitting, waiting to be processed, waiting to be read, waiting to be understood. Although I've never stated this publicly, part of my taking this new position was to take a break from LIS education. And this relates to the chosen title of my talk. Are you a footnote or in a margin? And I've added a line with my apologies to the poet, or have you been erased? I found that I could no longer justify my presence as a professor in an LIS program that did not see the lack of representation in the classroom or in the field in general, that did not see the paucity of people of color, that did not see the reproduction of white supremacy as something that they could actually address or as something that was worthy of their effort to try to address. And the less that was said about it, the more I thought about it. Why are there so few Black archivists? Why can I count the number of Black students I've had in 3 years on one hand? So I left that position and took this new position in order to experiment with possible answers and solutions. You may ask, why is it so important that people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, Latina people, Asian people, why is it so important that they be in the room? I actually had someone in a position of authority, of power at a university say, it doesn't really matter if those people are present or not present. We're basically, we're nice, kind-hearted white people, right? We're not bad people. We're not doing anything wrong. And I also had an administrator say things like, diversity is expensive. We can't necessarily afford diversity. Those are some of the things that have pushed me to see the rhetoric of my field versus the reality of my field. Now, I'm under no illusions. I'm still at a major university that is not innocent, but that is to some extent trying to address some of the past mistakes it has made with regards to the Black community in Chicago. One of the things that I think our dear respected archival forefather, was it Schellenberg, said was that, appraisal done by the heterogeneous group would be more trustworthy, right, than a homogeneous group. So let's look for an example. This is a picture that I've taken from the New York Public Library's digital collection. We can look at the caption that is given. The caption says, 1935, children playing cards in front yard in slum area near Union Station. Photographer Carl Maidens, I think, New York Public Library. But when I look at this picture, I see something else going on. I see the reproduction of social power. I see children knowing their place and other people reminding them of their place. I see 3 Black children who seem like they might want to be playing with the other kids, but understand that they cannot. And I see some white children reinforcing racial boundaries that they have no doubt been taught by their own families. Can you say all of this in the description of the photo? How do we say all of this? How do we not say anything? In the wake of the silences and the strong desire to speak and be heard, we have community archives. They are celebrated in our field. And yet, as archival scholar Anne Gilliland has explained to me many times and has written about in her many works on community archives are, in essence, a failure of our field to be inclusive. It's people being forced to document themselves because we do not present representations that they think are authentic. So I'm going to talk about 2 community archives that I've been able to visit in the past few months. So last year, after the Society of American Archivists Conference in DC, I took a stroll down the street from the hotel, just close to the hotel, to the Museum of the Palestinian People. This museum has its own online experience if you'd like to see for yourself. The museum is what we would call probably in our field a community archive. It's a celebration of Palestinian culture and traditions, and there was also, some archival records. There were archival documents, the kind that you're used to seeing, old passports, coins. And now obviously within the Palestinian context, the archival is powerful because it proves the existence of their community before 1948, a history which is often denied them. But what really struck me was the presence within their permanent collection of the 1914 copy of the National Geographic. Now, I'm probably dating myself, but the National Geographic was definitely part of my childhood, piled up stacks of yellow magazines that could be read as a way to travel the world. What struck me at the Museum of the Palestinian People was the place that this 1914 edition of the National Geographic, the importance of its narrative for Palestinians, even while it is clearly given the viewpoint of an Orientalist American missionary expedition to the Holy Lands. It still provides for them, and which is why it's in their collection and has such a highlight part of their permanent collection. It provides a document, a record, evidence of their existence on the land. You see within this cover of this magazine, you see Palestinians farming, worshiping, washing their clothes, feeding their children. And I was really struck by its use as a record in such a way. Now, fast forward a few months, unfortunate months later, with the bombings that have not stopped, and the genocidal killings of more than 30,000 Palestinian civilians, children's parents. And I was invited to visit another Palestinian museum, which I think we would definitely also call a community archive within our field, this one in Connecticut. The museum is impressive with its permanent collection of art, books, and archival materials. But if you were driving down the street, you would not see a sign for the museum. And the museum owns the building where it is housed in order to make itself less vulnerable to outside pressure. So those are two things that struck me immediately, that this rich collection and all of the materials and a community donating and funds being used, and yet the boundaries, the social boundaries within which it has to live, this museum itself. These museums are working to preserve in the face of the immensity of what has actively been and being destroyed in Palestine for many decades. So in February 2024, librarians and archivists for Palestine had this to say in a report that they released on the destruction of cultural heritage materials in Gaza. This report documents the destruction of religious sites, archaeological evidence, cultural institutions, and more. We bring a focus on libraries, archives, and museums as sites of knowledge, community spaces, and repositories of cultural heritage. Irreplaceable historic materials have been lost in the destruction of institutions such as the Central Archives of Gaza, City, and Rafah Museum. The destruction of libraries represents the loss not only of book collections, but the efforts of Gaza's librarians to acquire, care for, and provide access to reading materials, despite Israel's ongoing blockade of the Gaza Strip. Finally, we include information about the librarians and archivists who have been killed in the ongoing Israeli bombardment. We mourn the deaths of our colleagues and their families. So in this report, they list the names of different archives and libraries that have been destroyed. So this is the Central Archives of Gaza City, the Omari Mosque and Library, Al-Isra University Library and National Museum. As anyone following the news knows, every university in Gaza has been destroyed and many, many professors and students have been killed. The Gaza Municipal Library in Gaza City also destroyed. So where does that leave me as someone straddling all of these spaces in the library and information science field, in the field of Middle East studies? One thing that I've noticed is the deafening archivist silences. And I know it's rather trite to have a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. I think it's probably the first time I've ever used one in the talk. But this quote from the Reverend Martin Luther King has been going around and around in my head for several months. When he says, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Martin Luther King spoke a lot about silence and the courage to overcome silence, especially in his latter years when he discussed the Vietnam War. I think what's really struck me and why this quote has come up for me is that the passion with which my field took in discussing book bans and the right to read was not expended and could not be extended to Palestinian life. That those who called for social justice found nothing to say about the situation. The SAA only issued a tepid statement 3 days ago, March 23rd, 2024, about what is happening in Palestine. The ALA wrote a robust call for a ceasefire. If you read it, you can look it up. It's actually a very, I think, very well done, well-rounded call for a ceasefire. But that call was defeated because, quote, this is from the ALA website, quote, with the majority of opposers noting that the scope was outside of ALA's purview, the resolution was defeated. So even if we suppose that condemning the killings of innocent people is outside the purview of librarians and archivists, why has a field that prides itself on being the go-to experts on media literacy, information literacy, found nothing to say in this moment? How does your archives or library silence, marginalize, or erase Palestine and Palestinians? And to whom else does it do this? Is it in your metadata? Is it in your collection policy? I'm asking this question because I think it needs to be asked, and because I don't know what else to say to the field about in this moment. I'm going to end here with another line from the poem by Tamima Barghouti. This is at the very end of the poem. The very end of the poem, Tamim says, "Let your eye not weep, you who've been dropped from the text." And then it ends, "I see no one except for you." Thank you very much. I will end it there and take any questions that there might be.
Thank you very much, Sumayya. If anyone has a question, I believe you can probably raise your hand and we can let you ask in video. Otherwise, feel free to type it into the chat or the Q&A. So while we're waiting for that to come in, Sumayya, I was wondering if you might be interested to tell us a little bit about what you see as the potential for your new position, the kind of change that you're made and the changes that you're hoping to affect.
Well, one of the things I hope to do, which tried to address in this talk, is to encourage more people of color to come into the field of archives. So one of my hypotheses that I'm hoping to test out is that if people see materials related to their own culture, that maybe they would be more interested in taking stewardship for those things, and also just helping people who don't know so much about taking care of materials that are still in their possession. I think there's a lot of outreach that needs to be done, but I really do want to validate the place of people in the field. And so I hope to be able to do that from this new position.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and just read these out for those who might not be able to see the chat. We have, what role can Black library professionals, archivists, or otherwise play in speaking up for marginalized groups, Palestinians, Sudanese, Congolese, etc.? Any thoughts on that, Sumayya?
Well, they always say, you have to use what you have, what's in front of you. I think one of the interesting things you might do, something that I do, search your own library catalog, search your own archival records, your finding aids. Right now, one of the big things, one of the hot topics, which is very valid and important thing, is redescription, reparative description. But, especially if you're near the institution, or even if you're older institutions, actually, if you have the time to go look and see, how are we describing people? What are some of the accepted things maybe within our records that you think maybe could be updated and changed, that are inaccurate? I think that's, you can start where you are in that way. Obviously, we can go out and say things further, raising money. I think that Libraries and Archivists for Palestine are a great example of a group of people who do what they can. They do trips to the area when it was safe. They would do trips and try to help with things, but also just spreading knowledge. But I think you would be surprised if everyone just kind of looks at their own where the evidence institution they're at, kind of look at their own materials and really do some reappraisal of the descriptions and the collections, and see about what kind of what things we're accepting, what kind of narratives do we accept, or do we that maybe we should not accept anymore. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. Classic move. We have one in the chat and a couple in the Q&A. I'll just go ahead and read them out. The first is stating a bit more of a comment than a question. There's so much DEIA, sorry, work being done, but the issue of Palestine is so hidden. So, for example, the mesh vocabulary that has anything about Gaza and the West Bank is buried under the generic Middle East. Whenever I mention this, management just nods, if that. I'll go to the chat because I think this was in the order that they were stated. The question is, what are the projections for inclusion in the context of digital archives and new media platforms?
Not quite sure I understand the question, inclusion in terms of conclusion of collections of different people. I'm assuming the person means like, does the digital offer new space for inclusion as opposed to analog? This is what I'm thinking. The question, does that seem, Cal, does that seem, is that what you're reading from it?
That's how I would take it, but
Okay.
feel free to clarify
Yeah.
also if you pose the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if Abdullah would like to, that's how I'm understanding it. I think, right. So definitely there's some amazing digital archives, community archives that are on digital platforms because of the space that they offer. But obviously we have to be very careful with that. We have we have an expert here on this. We have a digital experts here. We can't be complacent to think that the digital is very fragile. And I think we have the word on the street is that you'll see people saying things like the internet lasts forever, or things like that. Whereas we know that that's just not how it works, and that things are actually more fragile than analog. And so I think it's great to see these. I'm always, love to see communities putting themselves online and using these digital platforms, but they have to do it in a way that's actually sustainable. And obviously any proprietary thing like, all of the, the social media things, those are generally not going to be your best place to do things like that. And so I think that what is needed is, once again, we need the expertise. We need people to have some of the training in the field to know, okay, how do we do this sustainably? And we need people who care about these communities to help people do things and on these platforms in ways that can actually have a longevity and not get a 404 message in a few years. So yeah.
Okay, well, some of these are pretty tough questions. Here's another one. How can LIS education programs across the country begin to change things so that there are more diverse students enrolled and pursuing the career path? Of course, some have strategies in place, others may not so much. I often think one of the missing links is outreach to library workers without the LIS degree. So obviously, Sumayya, you already have provided at least one answer, which is about having better representation in the collection so that people will be more inspired to pursue these things professionally. But I know there are a lot more complex answers to it than just that as well.
Well, I can only answer based on my experiences. So I, taught at two universities with very different student bodies. There has to be, first of all, an interest in actually doing that. So there has to be an interest, there has to be some money put behind it. There also, you can go to people and explain to them. I think one of the things that actually trying to recruit people, going to places where, university admissions is very, from my view of what I've seen of university admissions, they can be very kind of complacent with the places where they go and the people that they reach out to, and maybe kind of going off the beaten track a little bit, getting out of their comfort zone, and really taking this field to the places where it's needed, which is not necessarily going to be always the nice liberal arts colleges that we're used to. I think that's one of the ways to do it. I think also create an environment where people actually want to stay in. So one of the issues with our field is not just recruitment, but it's retention. We don't create environments where people feel that they have a place. Part of that is where people feel like they can bring their whole selves to their field. They can bring that they can actually discuss things. They can ask questions. I think sometimes in our field we're taken aback by people even asking questions, by people even questioning the status quo. And I think, people come who have different experiences and different backgrounds, just, they don't take things as a given. They have questions, and being open to questioning about why things are how they are. So I think in the beginning, people thought that the solution was always like scholarships. Not that money doesn't help, but I think that we actually have to try it. And I think what I've seen so far is that there hasn't been a concerted effort to make a place, make people feel welcome, kind of the sort of things I talked about Barbara Moran doing for me when I started at UNC Sills. And she did that for me without me, and I literally, it's in hindsight that I see what she was doing for me. And that's the beauty of it. I didn't see it when it was happening, what she was doing for me. And it kind of the same thing that Cal did for me as well. So Cal was my advisor when I was at UNC. But these are things that we do. You do things for people and they don't necessarily have to notice it or even know that you're doing the advocating for them. And I think that we have to do more of that to keep people in the field.
Thank you, Sumayya. Yeah, some terrific things for us to really try to aspire to that we often feel like we're failing on, but doesn't mean we can't try, right?
Yeah.
So we have a little time for other questions, either through the Q&A or the chat. Okay, so this one is your perspective on the rare book is interesting. I was thinking that it was a good thing that a copy was available to circulate freely instead of being locked away, inconvenient to access and use, and less discoverable in the collection. Books treated as rare can be treated so differently that it takes so far more effort to use. Do you consider this angle? So
That's interesting.
obviously a
I guess
very,
it would depend on where. So because of I try not to give too much information about where this public library is located, but because of the community in this library, I just didn't feel like this was a community where this book would be necessarily respected. And like I said, this 1941 edition, you can look it up. It's not it is something that it's not easily replaced. It's not something they're not going to be able to replace this first edition of this book. And I think yeah, I still hold that it shouldn't be there. But I won't check it out and take it home. So I don't know what I hope to happen. I just think that I'm not asking for it to be taken out of I mean, I'm asking her to put it into the reference section of the library, which it's a public library. Their inability to see that as being even considering that, to me is problematic. Whereas she noted, and I noticed as well that that all the other libraries that have that in our area have it in library use only. They understand its value. So for me, I was interpreting it as her not believing it's as to be worth what I believe it to be worth. So yeah.
and I would just add to that for those not as familiar with the field that this this movement towards special collections or rare books, right, where there's more respect for the artifactual value in a way that requires a certain kind of curation is clearly something that's very longstanding in the field, and it's reflecting an institutional decision that this doesn't have that kind of artifactual value, right? That we'll treat it like anything else that we could replace for circulation versus seeing it as having artifactual value. So, remaining questions?
I think there's one that was just put in the chat.
Okay, yep, I see that. So do you advocate for communities to keep their own archives or to work with established institutions to take care of their archival materials? Sometimes community members are unaware or mistrusting of established institutions, but might not have the capacity to care for materials themselves. Is there a model that those communities can follow to ensure that they have some say in the description and exhibiting of their collection?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that I'm a part of some committees and some projects I'm a part of now are trying to really kind of hammer this out. What should be the relationship between communities or community archives or private individuals and institutions? How do you work that out so that it's something that doesn't seem to be exploitative? And I think you'll see a lot of work coming out trying to literally provide guidelines or provide guidance. I think even the Black Metropolis Research Consortium on our website, we have something called like a legacy portal, which is trying to give guidelines to people who have materials who are trying to figure out what to do with them or should they give them away. So it doesn't tell them what to do, but it tells them like the kind of questions they should ask. Because I think a lot of people don't understand the world of libraries and archives like we do. They don't understand the players. They don't understand how things change in collections. They definitely don't understand that even though sometimes you give something to an repository, they might not keep it. That they could have, that when you sign over things, it becomes their property and they can make decisions about them. So I think one thing is for people that people need to be aware of all of the things that can happen to the materials once they're given over, that they're no longer sometimes, I mean, and obviously there can be conditions that they can put conditions on things. Sometimes some people don't understand that. There can be conditions to gifting. I think there just need to be a lot of education about how things work. And I also think that there is a beauty of things staying within a community, right? If they can be sustainably kept within a community, we have this post-custodial model. There is digitization and I love the fact that our indigenous brothers and sisters are teaching us a lot about this idea that, right, the community can retain the originals and maybe the repository can have a digital version of it, that there can be multiple copies of things, but that communities don't necessarily have to give away everything. So I think it has to be taken on a case-by-case basis, but really needs to be, and people need to be informed about the way archives and libraries work, special collections work, so that they know what they're getting, what kind of relationship they're getting themselves into. I think that's what I would suggest.
So thank you for the excellent questions. We should have time for at least another question for anyone who has one.
I can just read some poetry until we wrap us out. Just joking. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I would ask Sumayya if you have a real depth of knowledge and experience in a variety of contexts outside the U.S. as well, and I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about you know places where these processes are going well in other parts of the world that we should be paying attention to, essentially trying to reconcile these issues.
You mean issues of archival? What issue exactly
Sorry,
can I
yeah,
recite?
that was too vague to be useful.
Mm,
Yeah, I just meant in trying to be inclusive of populations that aren't very well represented in their historical record, I guess.
yeah. Um,
I
I
think we have
think
lots of examples of it going badly, right?
Right. I think you really have to have different people in the room. And I think this is the thing that it's the hardest thing and not only different people, like they can't just look different. You have to people who think differently. And I think one of the things that we're really comfortable with, we like these nice photo shoots where people kind of look different, but we don't want them to think or say anything differently from each other. And I think that's where I'm at right now. I can't see, you have to have people who have a say, who can put different ways of thinking on the table, and have to be taken seriously. And I don't see we get to any place until we do that. And I think that's one of my issues with why um, teaching in a very homogeneous library science program, I couldn't justify it after so long, because I couldn't see that it was doing much to address any of the issues we had. And so we just have to kind of take it more seriously, and like I said, and not be intimidated by difference, in the sense of people proposing different ways of looking at things, people asking questions. That's the only thing I have for right now. In terms of different parts of the world, I think there's so many different historical things that have been set in motion in different parts of the world, and other parts of the world that are a lot of dealing with colonialism, either as the colonizers or the people who were colonized. I think that there are just so many different, I didn't have to be more, have a more specific example to say, but I think people are, right now I see a trend in certain places where people are just trying to collect as much as they can, not a lot of appraisal, because they've had so much taken from them, and for so long that right now it's just like, let's just save whatever we can, which I think is very interesting, because coming from, obviously from the West, you think like, oh wow, is that really going to have any kind of value? But so this is interesting to see this. I can see some places where people are just like, let's just save everything and we'll figure it out later because we've just lost so much, which I think it'll be interesting to see how that develops. One thing I always say is that different places, we still need archival education. I think archival education, as you know, Cal, you've seen the ARI program, you've seen it grow in the United States. It needs to grow internationally, but it needs to grow internationally according to the standards and to the cultures of those places. And I think this is one thing that, of all the, we can, I'm not for America exporting its culture, but I am, but I would love to export a little bit more of archival education that fits cultural standards, right? So that would be something I would love to see. Mm,
Terrific goal.
yeah.
Well, thank you again, Sumayya, and thank you everyone for joining, and Alex for doing the introduction. I certainly gained a lot of new insights and really appreciated the time for everybody to join together. Stay tuned for other alumni talks that we'll have coming up in the series. And thank you very much for your time, everyone.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumayya.
Yeah. Thank you.